Now, sure, we've heard rumors of a desire to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. But could it happen sooner than we think? According to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the managing director of the IMF, the #1 problem with the international monetary system that must be corrected if we want to avoid another meltdown is volatility. And the #1 provider of that market volatility is yours truly, the almighty dollar, managed by the almighty Ben Bernanke. So yesterday, the IMF issued a report considering special drawing rights, or SDRs, as a possible replacement for the dollar, which could help stabilize the global financial system, according to them. So what do we say? Could that idea actually work? Well, joining me from our studio in New York is Joe Weisenthal, deputy editor of the Business Insider. Joe, thanks so much for joining us. Now, let's start with what an SDR even is. I'm sure that I could give a really poor explanation here, but I'm going to go ahead and let you give your very educated one.
Yeah, I mean, it's really not that complicated. It's basically an asset that represents a basket of currencies from from various IMF members. So if you had an SDR, a special drawing right, that would entitle you to X amount of dollars and X amount of euros and certain of Chinese yuan and the yen and stuff like that. I think it's not really an accurate characterization to call it a currency. It's not, it gives you right to a currency, gives you right to money, but in itself, it can't really be thought of as a replacement for the dollar.
Well, you mentioned the yuan, but in order for this to even work the way that the IMF wants it to, the yuan, the BRIC countries would also have to become a part of SDRs because at the moment they're not. So, how long until that kind of a plan could really take hold?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem, right? You'd have to have all these different currency, for it to be any kind of a global currency. You'd have to have all these different participants in it. And I don't really see that happening. I mean, you'll have that to some extent as these economies get bigger and they allow their currencies to float more. They will play a role in international commerce and all this stuff. That being said, look what happened to the euro, and we can learn a lot of lessons right from there. The desire to get involved in currency unions and these kind of common currencies should really be diminished after seeing the experience that they've had.
Well, I was wondering about that because, the IMF here claims that really this would stabilize the global system. But would anybody be willing to give the IMF that much power, that much centralized power, or would we see a lot of political opposition here?
No, that's actually a really good point. Look, there are a lot of flaws with the U.S. economic system right now and the amount of debt we have and concerns about the Fed. But over, hundreds of years, the U.S. has established some credibility as a stable government and a government that people around the world trust. Where would the IMF draw its trust from? It doesn't. So as you say, this idea that it could establish itself as a centralized authority for global currency comes out of nowhere. You can't just get that overnight or get that with a handshake agreement. It has to be built up over time.
But at the same time, isn't some, trust within the dollar waning? Aren't people starting to think that perhaps Ben Bernanke has a little bit too much power over the global economy, and he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States? It's, domestic national economy of the U.S. that really comes first in his mind.
Yeah, and that is definitely an issue. And it might be the case where the dollar's role as the global currency or the global reserve currency diminishes, and that might actually be fine. Look, China can do trade with Brazil and their own currencies and trade with Russia, and that could go somewhere, and it doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. is doomed, that the dollar is going to be worth as much as toilet paper. A good example is the Japanese yen. That's not a global reserve currency. It's a global currency. It's used all around the world in various transactions, but it's not considered to be the global currency. And yet it's perfectly fine, and the yen has been strong for a long time. So it's certainly conceivable that over time the U.S., the dollar will recede and no longer be considered the one currency. But it'd be okay. And in fact, Ben Bernanke gave a speech last year where he kind of hinted that that would be a good thing, that it would be good for the U.S. to have more flexibility and not not be so tied to the rest of the world with its currency. It might, it could go and it wouldn't be that big of a deal.
Well, that's interesting because there are some different takes on there. Some would say this would be a good thing for the U.S. because they'd have more flexibility. Others would argue that at the moment the U.S. has a little bit too much flexibility as the world's reserve currency because it brings in so much investment. We get to keep funding our debt. That if someone else was the reserve currency, then perhaps, there would be a lot more external pressure there for our economy, and that would make us, be a little more responsible. What do you say to that?
Yeah, there is something to that, perhaps, that the fact that we have this global reserve currency allows us to spend without discipline. I tend to think that's a little overstated. Well, as I said, there are other countries that don't have global reserve currencies that have, the UK is a debt level that's similar to ours. Australia has a debt level that's similar to ours. Japan has a debt level that's higher than ours, their government. So the connection between debt and the cost of funding and the strength of the currency, it's not clear. It's not as clean as people would like to believe. And I think we could, if the dollar no longer were the dominant world currency, it wouldn't necessarily mean the end of cheap funding for the U.S.
Okay, Joe, really quick, lastly, they're also thinking that perhaps things like oil or gold should also be coming in SDRs because then, if the dollar loses, goes down in value, we won't see spikes in oil prices. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that actually just seems even crazier to me. Even the World Bank chief said something about that last year, saying, we should benchmark all currencies to gold. Gold and oil are incredibly volatile. Look, you could have a situation in Egypt and gold could spike 10% in a day or more. You shut down the Suez Canal. Who knows what's going to happen? There's nothing inherently less volatile about those assets. In fact, I think they're more volatile than the U.S. dollar. So I think that's a pipe dream to think that would solve some kind of problem.
All right, Joe, well, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see if this does remain just a pipe dream, but a lot of people are definitely talking about it.